Hello and welcome to episode 22 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And today we are continuing our discussion of early modern philosophers. Today we're talking from Hume to Hegel.
You sure it's not Hegel?
It's probably Hegel.
It's Hegel.
It's Hegel. Starting off, David Hume. So David Hume was very much an empiricist. So he wrote this treatise of human nature, but it really only became popular, became famous after his death. During his life, he was not very popular, not very well known at all. And he very much wanted to continue this experimental method of philosophy, more of a scientific approach, test your hypothesis in the field of philosophy.
Can you articulate his theory, though? The changing, basically the necessary causation or connection, cause and effect stuff.
Yeah, so basically he believed that everything really boiled down to cause and effect. All knowledge depends upon cause and effect. And with that, there's really this idea that all voluntary behavior is motivated by passion. And really, passion always overtakes reason. Reason cannot cancel out passion. And so with that, with these human beings,
he seems to define passion pretty widely. Not like, I'm angry, so it overcame my reason. It's like
more of pleasure and pain is really what drives everything in a broad sort of sense. Really, in that, we
wasn't that a name of a Rob bass song from the 1980s or 90s?
How would I know that?
Oh,
but maybe
no, joy and pain. Yeah, I think that's what it was. Joy and pain. Sorry, go ahead.
So he really believed that humans really derive their behavior from these passions, and really we cannot think above these passions. Passions can only be canceled out by other passions. So, say if I was very, very happy about something, my actions would really be entirely dependent on that feeling of happiness, and those actions could really only be changed if I was overcome with a different passion, such as sadness, and then my actions would be kind of determined on that. That's a very broad understanding of that. He kind of takes it to more individual circumstances where our passions would be, but in the broad sense, that is his belief on cause and effect.
Yeah, then his theory of morals or morality is kind of interesting how he develops that too, but it's that it's not the product of reason, but of some sort of moral sense.
Yes.
So it's not really a rational, ethical philosophy. It's just whatever your moral sense is.
It was feelings of sympathy with others. That was his real driving. Our good moral interactions are those in which we feel sympathy for the other person. So it kind of boils down like all the virtues are really all kind of centered on these feelings of sympathy. Like, for example, justice only really works because we have sympathy, for other people to be treated fairly. If we were in that situation, we'd want to be treated fairly as well.
Right. What do you think of that? What do you think of either of his theories, I guess you should ask?
I disagree that everything is derived from passions. I do think, we can use reason to kind of think like, if I'm very, very passionate about something, I can kind of take a step back, think things through, what are the actual outcomes of this? Maybe that's not such a good decision. Maybe I am acting too rashly. I do think reason can overcome our passions. In regards to, kind of the sympathy with others, I think that's an interesting way of looking at things. I'm not sure if I entirely agree, if I entirely disagree. I'd have to kind of look into it a little bit more. But it is interesting because I do think, the best decisions we make are when we kind of consider really the general effects for everybody involved in that decision.
Yes.
So
no, I agree. That's an interesting. It almost seems though it's almost too broad of a definition or of a theory for morality. Just the sympathy thing, and then what about sociopaths? They don't really have that sort of, or not even sociopaths. I guess there's a different clinical definition for people that just can't. In fact, there's a personality type that you don't really sympathize with other people or empathize with them. Is that a moral failing or is that neutral? I don't know. Under his theory.
Yeah. Moving on to Smith and Reed.
That sounds like a good old, either a haberdasher or a law firm.
Yeah, it really does. Adam Smith.
Isn't it a hat store, haberdasher?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I just kind of blankly agreed with you because I figured you knew what you were talking about. It does sound like a law firm name, though. So Adam Smith, he really believed, he kind of extended Hume's beliefs on sympathy. He believed that sympathy can arise from sharing any passion, not just, this pleasure, this pain. That's really kind of what defined Hume's beliefs. So really he believed that, in any situation, any good moral decision, it's not just pleasure, it's not just pain. We can feel sympathy towards those people. So a little bit broader sense of Hume's understanding. And then he also believed that we really need society to really understand who we are.
I thought this is interesting. Yeah.
We need the mirror of society to show us ourselves. So we need to kind of distance ourselves from our own motives and judgments to determine if those motives and judgments are really just, if they are fair, because, we have our own biases towards our own beliefs and opinions because they're ours. We tend to value those.
Right.
He kind of says, like, if a man grows up living on a deserted island, he really wouldn't have any idea of whether or not his passions are just or not. He has no mirror to bounce them off of. He has no way to distance himself, see himself from another person's point of view, because there is no other person's point of view. So he will always be right in his own mind. And I think he kind of says that's kind of a dangerous thing to have. You need this society, you need this kind of backdrop to be able to look at yourself and see if you are doing the right thing. Yeah,
and I wonder what he'd think of, like, societies that become perverted to some sort of evil goal, like Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, and of course Hitler's a good example. If everybody's looking at you like you're immoral or you're not following the rules, how he would address that as far as a person's morality. If the mirror image from society is that you're bad, but there has to be a way to know that you're good if everybody else is bad.
Yeah.
I don't think it's not addressed in the book. Mm-hmm. Maybe we'll get to it later.
Yeah. I do think that is a good way of, looking at things, that we do kind of need, just to look at things from other people's shoes, to distance ourselves from our own beliefs to see if they are correct or not.
I disagree with that.
Really?
Wholeheartedly, 100%.
Really? Why?
What is right and wrong is not relative or dependent upon somebody else's opinion. I'm either right or I'm wrong.
I guess that's true, yeah.
Period. And they're either right to agree with me or right to disagree with me. And the fact that there's some sort of cultural communication, I think that helps for somebody to develop intellectually. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it really informs us as to whether or not that particular proposition is correct, either moral or immoral, just because, it doesn't make you more moral to be with people. I don't think. I completely disagree. I think that if you are stranded on a desert island, you can form some idea of what is good or bad. I don't think it's dependent upon interaction, although I guess if you never live with other humans, you'd be in some sort of animal-like state.
Yeah.
But so maybe he has a point on that.
That's happened before.
Yeah.
The Wild Boy of Averon was a boy found in France in the 18th century who was found just living in the woods. He never had contact with other people.
Yeah.
We learned about this in psychology, and he never really fully developed as a human being because you need that, initial caretaking. It was also a thing in the 80s. They found a girl who had been basically neglected her entire life by her parents in California. They basically shut her up in a room,
right?
Never interacted with her for, like, I think 11 years of her life until she was eventually found by Child Protective Services.
Which brings me back to one of my axioms of political philosophy, which is not all parents love their children. And it offends me when anyone will say off the cuff, well, everybody agrees that parents love their children. Yeah. No, some of them torture them, some of them rape them, some of them kill them. And they're horrible human beings. And I don't care if I'm the only man on earth, they're still horrible human beings.
That was uplifting. Thomas Reid. So he was very anti-empiricist. So he was very kind of against Adam Smith's whole system of philosophy.
Adam Smith, also a famous economist. Wealth of Nations was his book.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't mention that. That is a notable thing to say about him.
Yeah, I didn't know that he was known as a philosopher aside from his, economics theory. Sorry to interrupt you again.
Yeah. So Thomas Reid, his real belief was that, the whole of philosophy can be just completely wrong if these philosophers start on a false notion, a false primal notion. So he kind of believed that, we don't really rely on this sympathy sort of idea. We don't really need this sort of, kind of bounce back from other people, because he really believed that ideas are fictions, and that propositions are building blocks of knowledge. And by this, what he meant is that we don't really need these, theoretical, perfect things. We don't need a lot of this kind of almost technical, I guess, philosophical stuff, these hypothetical situations. What we really need is we need to look at the facts in our society. We need to kind of make observations, and from that we build our knowledge. We don't need these hypotheticals, I guess you could say.
And isn't he also the one that believes that there's like a basic common sense
yep.
derived from God?
Yes, exactly. That's really what he believed.
That's like his first principle.
Opposed these, common ideas, these very big hypothetical things. He really believed that common sense, and this is really the first time we hear common sense used in the way that it is in the modern way today, because previously common sense was used by philosophers as kind of like this internal, kind of dividing thought, almost a more mystical sort of thing, almost a more theological sort of thing to help us determine between right and wrong. But what Thomas Reid does here is he uses common sense to say that, there are just some things that are facts in our life, and we have this common sense to decide that. And so with that, it's kind of just like math. He points to example, like we use common sense to understand math. These are just very fundamental principles in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Kind of differs from somebody that thinks they can reason through everything and come up with their basic philosophy absent this divinely inspired, I guess I know, divinely caused common sense basis, I guess. Interesting.
Moving on to the Enlightenment. So here there's just quite a few different philosophers that we kind of get just brief snippets of their ideas.
The Scottish Enlightenment first.
Yes, the Scottish Enlightenment, yes. That's
Pierre,
Adam Smith.
Pierre Bayle.
No, he was French.
Oh.
Pierre? You thought Pierre was a Scot?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. The Scottish Enlightenment was really Adam Smith and Thomas Reid, who we just talked about. Yes. So the
French Enlightenment?
Yes. That's really where, we get most of our big thinkers for the Enlightenment.
French thinkers.
Yes. Kenny says here that, of course, the Enlightenment was all over Europe, but primarily many consider, kind of the seat of the Enlightenment was in France at this time.
Yes.
And so the first of these was Pierre Bayle. And he really believed that ethics should be independent of theology. We can remove kind of the church, we can remove the theology of a lot of what's kind of driving the ethics of the time, and we can kind of determine that ourselves on our own, basically.
And you could pretty much figure that he had something going there, knowing the church at that time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And he also, I thought this was a pretty good point, that belief in human immortality or in the existence of God was not something necessary for virtuous living. So you could say, well, I don't believe in that or a soul, God or a soul, and they could still be a virtuous person.
Yeah.
So defined. I think I agree with that.
And there was also Baron de Montesquieu. One of his big writings was about the nature of the state, a more political writing that's discussed later in this book, I believe. But he really loved English philosophy, and this was a very common thread between these philosophers that we're talking about during this French Enlightenment, is that they really considered themselves more followers of these English philosophers that we talked, especially last episode, kind of the followers of them rather than the Descartes, the Spinoza of France. And so that was a very common theme between these philosophers.
You figure Montesquieu would favor the British, seeing how he was locked up twice in the Bastille for writing ignorant pamphlets about noblemen.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy to see where they're coming from.
Yeah. Like, well, you locked me up a couple times. I think I prefer the English. He was a Frenchman. Pierre.
And then we also had Voltaire. He was a very big Anglophile too, and he was really prominent in the creation of an encyclopedia, really kind of an all-encompassing book to help people just get a baseline for just knowledge about things, which is kind of a revolutionary concept at this time. Started in England, this idea of the encyclopedia, just a massive set of books where you could just put a lot of knowledge for people to learn relatively easily.
Interesting thinker too, not just encyclopedian.
Yes. Well, yes.
I don't know if that's a word.
Yes, I'll talk about maybe.
Is that a word? I don't know.
Maybe. And then there were also D'Alembert and Diderot.
Wait, we're not done with Voltaire, are we?
Well, Voltaire's continued a little bit later, but I'm just kind of giving a brief little bit here. Unless you want something to add right there.
Where did you skip to? What page did you go to?
I'm right down at the bottom of 570.
Oh, okay. Yeah, all right. Go ahead.
Okay. So then there were also D'Alembert and Diderot, and they believed that Christianity is an obstacle to human betterment. So they were very hardline, anti-church, very anti-theology, very much centered around, kind of, we can think for ourselves. We don't need the church telling us what to do. And these five guys...
Diderot also spent some time in prison.
Yes. These five guys, along with a couple other notable French philosophers, they formed this group. They called themselves, I believe, just the philosophers. which I think just means philosophers in French. But they were a very notable. They were a very notable group at this time, and they kind of have interactions with later philosophers in this section of reading.
Is that a good band name? Probably not.
The Philosophes?
Yeah, it seems kind of effeminate.
Yeah, it's a little
maybe if you had a girl band.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know. Can you say that anymore? All right, I'm sorry.
Yes.
What were we talking about?
I was just mentioning this group.
Yes.
They're a very high-profile group.
Are we going on to details of Voltaire yet?
Yes, that's what I was just about to say.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
So Voltaire, even though he was very anti-church and that sort of thing, he was not an atheist. He still believed that there was a God. And primarily he believed this because he believed that if God did not exist, then there would be no reason to invent him. Kind of very similar to Descartes' view, I believe. We talked in the last chapter that, even the very notion of God proves that God exists.
If God didn't exist,
there would be no reason to invent him.
Well,
you seem confused.
Well, his famous quote is, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Otherwise, a moral law would carry no weight.
Is that what he said?
Yes.
Maybe I completely misread that.
So like the middle of 571.
Oh, yes. If God did not exist, it would be necessary. Sorry, I read that completely wrong.
Yes. You read it it's the opposite.
The exact opposite, yes.
Just like I was saying the Pierre was a Scottish,
yes.
So like he had this theory about the evidence of the world is similar to the evidence of a watchmaker by seeing the watch. That the evidence of God or a creator is the fact that the world exists, just like a watch is evidence that there was a watchmaker.
Yes, sorry.
Which I think is a very simple and very, I think, persuasive argument for the existence of God. Much better than I can think of an ideal entity and therefore it must exist. I think the watchmaker analogy is much better myself. But
it's very similar to intelligent design.
Yes.
There's a necessary order for all these things, so something must have created this.
Yeah, just a different flavor of it, I think.
Moving on to Rousseau.
The father of the French Revolution, or inspiration, I should say. Inspiration for the French revolutionaries, which devolved into chaos and murder.
Yeah, so Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of his really defining philosophies was that humanity is naturally good and corrupted by social institutions. So I believe that we kind of are born with this innate sense of right and wrong. We will choose good, if we're kind of left to our own devices, but we're very much corrupted over time by our surroundings.
Definitely the opposite of the other guy, because he believes in the noble savage. So if you're left to your own devices, you would be pure, you'd be good. It's the society that corrupts you.
Yes. So I just kind of have a note here. He got on the philosophes' bad side because he was very much against basically everything they taught. They were very highbrow, very academic. We need to continue for the progress of science, for philosophy, for everything that matters. It needs to be civil. It needs to be kind of planned out, regulated, and that is how we better society. But Rousseau kind of goes exactly against that, saying that it would be better for the individual, for society to not have all of that, for us to just kind of rely on ourselves.
And I think this is the real danger of his philosophy, and that's why it really got perverted, or maybe perverted by the French Revolution, is the belief that an individual left to his own devices is moral, and the only reason why people do bad things is because society corrupts them or institutions corrupt them. Then you just want to destroy all the institutions, and then once you destroy the initial institutions, the worst ones, you still have corruption, you still have evil, you still have sin in the world or crime, and so you have to keep destroying the structure of society in ever greater amounts to try to get back to the purest noble savage state, and it's just so destructive. And it's oddly enough, I think it's much better to believe that we're all sinners by birth and we're all evil by birth, and it's only through societal and church and religious belief and study and self-improvement that we become good people, because then you have a more orderly society, and it takes work. It takes work to be a good person and consistently through your life. His philosophy just really opens up the floodgates of hell.
Well, he said, one of his most famous quotes is that man is born free and is everywhere in chains. So that's very much, kind of can very easily lead to that destructive sentiment that you say, that, for us to be free again, we have to remove all our chains, remove all our societal creations, basically. And to some extent, I do kind of agree with him. I've mentioned this several times on the podcast that I do believe that there is sort of an innate sense of right and wrong, some sort of justice within us. But I do not believe that we should destroy all of society to find that.
So if we're left to our own device, I mean, I understand. I don't think I disagree with that. There's a certain belief in right and wrong that we're all born with. But don't you believe that we all fall short of the ideals?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I think that somebody left on their own devices would become almost like an animal state. Like I was just saying, like we do need society to kind of bring us up and kind of encourage our innate ideals, I guess. Because if we are left to our own devices, then we do kind of just resort to, pain and pleasure. What do I want most immediately,
Right.
The very animal state. And through society, we can kind of remove, kind of the immediate pain, immediate pleasure, and focus more on like the intellectual.
Well, I think society. I view society more like a shepherd dog with a flock.
Yeah.
Kind of keeping those stragglers out from going off into murder land or into rape land. Yes. And you got the dog kind of keeping you in the straight and narrow, so to speak. And
that was kind of what I was trying to say. You used a more direct, blunt approach, but yeah. Yeah, I do think it is necessary to kind of keep us in line, and a good society helps to encourage, right and wrong, basically.
Yeah, moral behavior.
Yes.
and more tolerance of others, and as well as respect for other people, or else.
Yes.
If you don't have the or else,
yeah,
then you just have chaos, and the strongest will prevail.
Yes.
Moving along.
Like
I'm kind of in a doom and gloom mood.
You really
tonight.
are.
Sorry.
Yeah. I did just want to mention one last thing about Rousseau.
Yes.
Like I said, he was very much anti Voltaire, but he was buried next to Voltaire, and it's still there. His tomb is next to his lifelong enemy, which is kind of rough. Not gonna lie.
I don't know. Do you think he notices?
I guess not. Wolff and Lessing. So these are two German philosophers here. Christian Wolff, first and foremost, was very much a rationalist, and he believed in sufficient reason. Very similar to here, if I can find the section about sufficient reason.
Kind of interesting how Rousseau's considered like a romanticist. I guess he's romanticizing human nature, the noble innocence about us, I guess.
So Wolff really had very little original in his work.
But he's like the opposite of Rousseau, I think.
Yes, very much.
Right.
Very much. So he believed that we live in the best of all possible worlds, freely chosen by God's wisdom.
I don't understand that. Do you understand why people would think that this is the best possible world?
Because I guess it's then, kind of the argument, if we don't live in the best of all possible worlds, then why are we here? Because, why would God create us in a less than perfect world? Is, I guess, the line of thinking. Because, I guess if you're going to follow this frame of thought, then you're kind of like, well, God made a mistake by putting us here if this isn't the best of all possible worlds. But I very much differently agree. I agree with the other philosophy, kind of the counterpoint to that is that God, simple laws, everything functions according to the rules of nature, basically. And, the evil isn't necessarily God's fault. Right.
I agree with that latter philosophy as well. I just have a hard time... understanding how people, especially, there's a difference in their society and ours. Their society, the just like the infant mortality rate was just astronomical. Back in this late 1700s, in order to have, we have 4 kids in our family, in order to have 4 healthy kids that get to your ages, we probably would have had to 8 to 10 pregnancies to term. Because they would die in childbirth so often, and then die in the first 2 years so often. Often the mothers would die in childbirth because of complications. And that's just one example. And for them to think that that's the best possible world, where you have starvation, you have war, you have famine and disease and pestilence.
I guess
it was brutal.
It is probably important to note that a lot of the times these philosophers were not the working class citizen. They very often had very high positions, intellectual positions that were very comfy and luxurious.
I guess you'd tend to say, well, that's the natural order of things. So, I'm of this upper class because of
Voltaire
divine,
particularly called the common people rabble.
Right.
We shouldn't necessarily extend the boons of society to everyone because.
But don't you think there, at some level, if you're believing this philosophy, this is the best possible world, wouldn't the better possible world be less rabble?
Yeah.
I had a friend in law school that had the theory of the 10%. Yeah, he
I
had
don't think I've heard of this.
theory that this is definitely drunk talk. but he had a theory of 10%, which he had a whole philosophy built around the theory of 10%. There's 10% of the population that is drag on society, and we'd be much better off if a la Thanos. See, Thanos, he would have a problem with Thanos because the percentage was too high. But he would not have a problem with him about the general theory that there's a waste of resources.
Thanos, for all of our listeners who are not Marvel fans, Thanos was a supervillain who managed to snap and kill 50% of all living things, so that the other 50% could have their.
And I think it was all sentient life because he didn't kill all the plants, which I didn't understand, but I assume that it was all sentient beings because all these different little alien people were all killed off half-wise too across the universe. But yeah, so he had a theory that the bottom 10% should be wiped out. And I said, well, then what happens after you get that 10%? He says, well, then you just keep improving society every so often with another 10% cull. So I think
you get to one person.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you ever get there.
I guess you'd get to 9 people because then you can't take 10% of 9.
Well, yeah, maybe you have to figure that out.
Lucky 9, yeah.
I guess he had a limit, but that's the same kind of thought, I guess, that there are people that are you can be dispensed with or discarded. And it was a philosophy in jest, of course, that he was telling me. I hope.
Yes, moving back to Christian Wolff, we kind of went off on a very long tangent there, but he really believed that the basic human motivation is perfection. We all strive for perfection. No matter what it is that we're doing, we want to be perfect at it, be the best that we can possibly be. You really believe that the perfect human doing good only helps perfection. Doing bad kind of reduces us a little bit. Obstacles. It's fairly basic, I would say, kind of idea of what we're striving for.
And kind of idealized. I don't think people are really striving for perfection. They'd be lucky if they get to average.
You are very bleak.
In fact, they would be, because average would be half. So if you're above average, it's unlikely.
Yes. Moving on to Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, which is a very German name. So he really very highly emphasized the role of the poet in society in a weird way. This is something that I noticed, not necessarily vital to his philosophy, but he believed that the poet kind of has a special semi-prophetic role in society. He was very much kind of romanticizing, I guess, the role of a poet in society. He wanted to separate philosophy from poetry, and also dramas from poetry, kind of set aside poetry as its own thing, its own unique, special art form in a way, which I guess is...
He was talking about them as like spiritual activities.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And I perhaps they just had better poets.
It may be. But the modern poetry that I've read is not very...
I have to confess I haven't read very much poetry in my life.
I've read some,
and not especially modern stuff, because every like, what do they call isn't there a national poet? They always nominates. They always have. There's a federal appointment. I think they get a bunch of money to be the, what do they call it? The United States poet laureate, maybe.
Maybe that sounds right. Yeah,
they're always hacks.
Yeah, but
every last one.
I haven't read too much modern philosophy. We used to read poetry. Sorry, poetry. We used to read some, especially in grade school in our English classes. Yeah. My English grade school teacher. She was very much the poetry type.
That reminds me of a limerick.
We're not going to say the limerick. I'm a big fan of Tolkien's poetry, though. He's a great poet.
Is he?
Yes. Not much of his poetry is really published in his works. I mean, there's a decent amount in The Lord of the Rings, some in The Hobbit, where he writes his songs.
Some of the songs and sonnets.
But he wrote poems, in his made-up languages, which is just baffling.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that word.
It's impressive, very impressive to not only, create your own language, but then to understand it so fully that you can create poetry with it.
It seems so pointless.
I also read his commentary on Beowulf. The Old English poetry is actually really, really interesting. It's because I didn't really know how it was structured, but there's a very, not necessarily rigid structure, but there is a very notable structure with the way that syllables fall in the Old English style of writing. That was very, very interesting to read. So if any of our listeners are interested in Beowulf or Old English, I'd recommend reading his commentary on Beowulf.
Commentary on Beowulf. Interesting.
Yes.
By interesting, I mean yawn.
Yes.
Moving right along.
All right. So he really believed...
Who are we talking about?
Lessing.
Lessing.
Gotthold Lessing.
Gotthold Ephraim. Yes.
Yes. He also believed that historical evidence cannot justify any conclusion for truths about divinity. So he really believed that we can't look to, the past. We cannot look really to what's happened before us to prove the existence of God. And he really believed that religion only has symbolic value. So he really believed that society kind of evolves in waves almost, in that, we kind of, we look at the animals, and at some point we ourselves kind of were in sort of animal state. But, through religion, through theology, we've kind of advanced our understanding of morals and kind of ethics. But eventually we will be able to move past religion to a more fuller appreciation of ethics that is kind of beyond the understanding of God, and not everything is mandated by God.
Definitely a believer in the progress over time of the human
race. Yes, very much so.
It does not believe in like the never-changing belief in the character of man.
So that's why he believed that religion only has symbolic value, because it has value for us now to understand morality, but eventually at some point it won't matter anymore.
I think he is so wrong about that.
I think it's a strange theory.
I think the nature of man is relatively unchanged.
You think so?
The nature, yes, our character generally of men has not changed one whit from ancient Greece to now.
It's actually interesting that you say that, because I read the Epic of Gilgamesh a few weeks ago. I was telling you about this. And it's very kind of striking how much it still applies today. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, for those who don't know, which I'm sure is all of you, is one of the oldest stories we ever have, we've ever uncovered. Very, very ancient, thousands of years ago. I think it's like 2,700 BC. I think around that time is probably when the story was.
And where was that from?
Mesopotamia.
Like Persia?
Mesopotamia. So the city of Uruk, which is the oldest city that we know about as well.
And where would it be in modern day? Where would Uruk be?
Uruk, it would be in the Middle East on the Tigris and the Euphrates.
So I was right, Persian?
Persia, yeah. So it'd be the Persian region, so Saudi Arabia probably.
Or Iraq, I guess.
Yeah, Iraq, I think it was. It's very interesting, striking how much, it's kind of similar to a lot of modern thought, because a lot of the Epic of Gilgamesh is about, what kind of separates humans from animals, and a lot of that book points to friendship, in which Gilgamesh, he ends up getting this half-brother, this savage half-brother, made to be his perfect mirror image by the gods, and it's only through like friendship and camaraderie that Enkidu, which is the half-brother, he kind of learns to become human. And then when Enkidu dies, it's all about Gilgamesh trying to fight death, basically to find a way to live to the end of his to the end of existence, basically, because he's so racked with grief. If there's a way to bring Enkidu
wrap this
back.
around to how it's ever changing and applicable today.
Because I think, still what is still being discussed, is, what is the point of humanity? What separates us from animals? Why do we die? For example, that's a big part of, the oldest story we ever have is, why is there death? And I think that's still...
What comes after death?
What comes after death, absolutely. And that's really what's discussed in the oldest story we have ever.
You talk about all the, the myths better than I do, but the same kind of themes run through all those. And those for thousands of years ago, the same kind of struggle between... doing something that's the right thing to do, but it's difficult, overcoming obstacles, the challenges, and bad influences, the siren call, that type of thing. I mean, they're universal. And so
it is interesting because, Gilgamesh kind of inevitably causes Enkidu's death. Really kind of the moral of the story is that, you're going to make mistakes sometimes, and you can't just run from that. You can't just live forever to avoid your past mistakes. At some point, you do have to come to grips with that, and you have to return home.
Yep. So that's why I think the nature of man is the same. We're all individuals, and we all make our choices, and we all change during our lives, and we can grow, and we can develop. But like at our core, there's a certain unchanging. I call it the original sin or whatever. There's a certain level of character that has not changed, and there's a lot of people that mistake our affluence and our society and the things we have with us being better than people in the past, and the moral relative, oddly judgmental moral relative believers in modern day, where they're condemning these people from, the founding of the country. They weren't perfect, but, we aren't perfect either. And I'd venture to say that the vast majority of modern people would not be able to live up to the standards that our founding fathers of the country lived at the time they lived. But anyway, I guess I kind of went off into a...
Right, I guess kind of the underlying point is that you shouldn't just dismiss something just because it is old.
Right.
There's still value to be found in
Right.
old things.
Agreed.
Almost more value than I would say than is to be found in modern things.
If it's something that it is still being taught or read or published after this many years, there's something about it, like Homer, which I need to read. Those kind of Greek myths, that there's something to them, that they were saved and preserved and carried on. That there's some sort of message there that has to have some sort of universal, maybe not a truth, but some sort of value.
I would absolutely agree. I think that's almost spot on for why I like mythology so much. That's why I've read so much mythology. Is that it is so ancient, yet it still kind of speaks to us in a way.
Yes, sure does. Yeah, I agree.
Moving on to Kant. Yeah, so he very much wanted to make philosophy fully scientific. And so with that, he believed that there were some fundamental truths, kind of similar to how we were talking previously.
Right.
But he really wanted to separate everything into a lot of categories. A lot of this reading about Kant is very much setting up his different sort of categories and everything.
Right.
Like, for example, one of his fundamental differences, I won't go into all of his differences because he tries to, categorize everything.
Right. We're not going to go through all that.
Yes, no, absolutely not. But one of his most important ones was that the difference between understanding and reason. And he believed that understanding works with the senses to produce knowledge, and reason is intellect's endeavor to go beyond what understanding can achieve. So he did believe that, we can learn a lot about our world just by observing it. But, there are some things that we just want to go beyond observation. We want to uncover these fundamental truths. We want to figure out what is, kind of the purpose of humanity, essentially.
Right.
And so he believed, moving on here.
Bumping into something or something. I heard some noise.
I believe that's the room next door.
Oh, Lord.
Yes.
We have noisy neighbors.
Yes. Some noisy neighbors. We mean my mom.
Bang on the wall.
No, I will not do that.
All right, go ahead. Sorry.
So he also believed that, even though reason kind of is our desire to go beyond what understanding can achieve, he believed that reason has no right to talk about the world as a whole. He believed that, to some certain extent, there are just some things that we cannot reason through. There are some things that are either fundamental or just beyond our grasp in a way. But we will always strive to achieve those things. We always try to get there, but eventually it may be beyond our knowledge, and they are just fundamental, and that is it.
Right.
I was expecting a yes. I was really disappointed.
Yes, sorry. You're doing a great job explaining it.
And then he also believed, kind of moving on, he believed that the only thing that was good without qualifications is a good will. So everything else, if we see anything good in the world, you kind of have to put qualifications on that. If is it good relative to something else? Is it wholly good? Does it have flaws? And he believed that the only good thing is a good will. So, fundamentally...
as somebody who does estate planning, I would agree.
What does that mean?
A good will.
That was really awful. That was terrible.
It's a lawyer joke.
That was the worst. So he believed that the only really good thing was a person with a good will. So really, if you have that good will...
yeah, and I like that where, like, even if you try and fail, as long as you have the right will or right intent, I guess, then you're doing okay. However, I don't think it's the only thing, because you could think that you have the right will to do good, but maybe you're going about it all the wrong way. Yes. That 10% example comes to mind.
Exactly.
Well, I'm helping everybody. I'm helping out the 90%. I mean to do well. Snap. Well, again, kind of like Thanos.
Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, Thanos. The fictional character, of course.
Yes. He's not a real thing,
right? But his character absolutely believed it was the right thing to do, because of the lack of resources and the so much pain and suffering, and he's alleviated by killing half the sentient beings.
Yes,
it's an interesting philosophy. But if the will to do good is the only imperative, then Thanos is 100% man. He's 100% right.
Yeah,
in trying to murder half the universe.
So really, one of Kant's biggest beliefs was that a rational being is subject only to laws which are made by himself and yet are universal. So basically, he's kind of set up for society, for our good behavior, for ethics, for everything. Basically, is that we have to create laws ourselves. There's not going to be any guiding force that's going to tell us what to do. We have to set these rules for ourselves, and they have to be universal, and they have to be good. And to do that, we kind of have to get into the nature of human beings. We have to find that goodwill. We have to find everything that is good about society and make those the rules. We have to set that as the...
And then you have the examples of it's never right to tell a lie. Mm-hmm. And then you have the story of the lady screaming and running away from the axe murderer.
Yeah.
Saying, "Can I hide in your house?" And hides in your closet. And the axe murderer says, "Where is she? Is it right to lie?"
I mean, I'd say yes, it is right to lie. Yes.
No, the answer is, you don't have to answer. You just kill a guy.
Yes, of course, of course. Yes.
But those, like those categorical imperatives. But you could always define the rule limited.
Yes.
So that it doesn't apply to that.
Mm-hmm.
But he's talking about universals, but I guess it depends on how universal you need to get them.
Well, that's probably why he was trying to make it into a strict science, basically, right. To make everything applicable to everything.
It's hard.
Yes, almost very impossible.
Yeah.
So that's what Kenny really kind of says. It's very hard to read Kant because he uses a lot of technical terms. He tries to overly categorize everything. It's very hard to get through, I guess.
He likes his categorical imperative.
Moving on to Fichte in Schelling.
Yeah, sure.
Johann Gottlieb Fichte. So he wrote in the style of Kant. He was not very religious. In fact, he was fired for being insufficiently religious from a teaching position. And he also very much believed that the whole of consciousness was derived from free experience of thinking subject. So basically everything that we understand, everything that we come to realize is derived from our own free experience. We have ultimate free will, basically. And with that, everything that we see, everything that we do, everything that we hear, listen, basically, that is what derives who we are. That is what creates our thinking, essentially.
Doesn't he have a belief of God being like the being, like he's a pantheist, or am I thinking of somebody else?
Yeah, no, you're thinking of the right guy.
Okay, all right.
Yes, he says that it is not the finite self that exists. It is the divine idea that is the foundation of all philosophy. Everything that man does of himself is null and void. All existence is living and active in itself, and there's no other life than being, and no other being than God. So everything kind of comes back to everything is God.
Right.
Yes.
I'm God, you're God, we're all part of God.
And so that's why the whole of consciousness is derived from our experiences, because we are all of consciousness.
Right.
Yes.
I don't know.
It's weird.
Stupid.
F.W.J. Schelling. So he believed that the initial absolute gives rise to spiritual consciousness and a physical nature. So he kind of believed that there's a primal thing that basically gives us both our kind of soul and our body. That is kind of where we derive everything from. We owe everything to that initial being. He never really kind of explicitly says that it is God. It is just something that kind of divides our spiritual self and our physical self. And that's really all that's kind of said about Schelling here.
Yeah, I didn't think he was that important.
No. Hegel.
This is our last guy.
Yes, this is our last guy in this podcast.
Again, I wonder if women had a more equal footing in the universities back then, how many brilliant philosophers we would have had more than what we do here. Because all we've talked about, except for I think there's one example, I'm trying to remember who she was.
Way back in ancient Greece.
They're all men.
Yes.
All right, but I digress. Hegel.
Yeah, so he gave history a very special place in philosophy. Mm-hmm. And he also gave philosophers a very special place in history, because he really believed that philosophers have a very unique way of looking at the world through reason.
Right.
And it is through this reason that history is very much a rational experience. We very much look at history via reason, and that is why philosophers should have their place in history.
I agree with both of those concepts.
And then he also believed that the existence of spirit is a matter of logic via dialect. So he used this dialect where he kind of posed two theories about things, and then basically he would argue out both of these theories, and either he would kind of blend them, or he would... a dialectic, I'm sorry, was I saying dialect?
Yes.
I think I was saying dialect. Mm-hmm. Dialectic is this practice of, kind of creating these two theories and then pitting them against each other, maybe merging them in the end, maybe picking a winner. And that's kind of how all of his philosophy is written. And his idea of spirit is very strange. because he believed very much in the kind of the progress of everything.
It's
and
kind
that's
of like a hippie. Like
a little bit.
He'd be like happy would have flowers in his hair or something.
He sounds like a hippie. Hegel. Yeah. So he was very much believed that
Hegel.
Yeah.
I believe in the spirit.
Yes. Everything kind of goes back to the spirit. The history of the world is history of this ever-growing self-consciousness of the spirit. And so that's kind of traces like ages of history through our understanding of ourselves, understandings of ethics and morality. Very similar to that kind of progress that I was talking about earlier.
Right.
Kind of from that animal state, then we kind of view the spirit through religion, and then eventually we'll be able to view the spirit more clearly on our own without religion, that sort of thing.
Isn't he? I'm reading this quote here. I think doesn't this kind of summarize it? Everything that from eternity has happened in heaven and earth, the life of God and all the deeds of time are simply the struggles of spirit to know itself and define itself.
Yes. Absolutely. So all of our history is us looking at ourselves.
It's kind of like when Gandalf was fighting that Balrog. It was just kind of, it's like, but if that was one being fighting itself, struggling with itself till the end of
I don't think that analogy makes any sense here. You just tried to draw a Tolkien parallel and it did not work.
I thought it did.
You just said
the fight
this
did
one
end.
guy fighting this other guy is like an eternal fight with yourself.
Yes. Yeah, I think that works.
You're just saying a fight is like a different fight.
Well, it's an analogy. It's not the
Not
same.
a very good one.
All right, fine. Well, how would you say it then? How would you work Tolkien?
I don't think we need the Tolkien analogy.
Okay.
So he also believed more of his political theory was that the state does not exist for the sake of its citizens, and that citizens really only possess worth as members of the state. And this kind of goes into his understanding of the progress of the spirit. He believed that each nation really kind of had its own time to shine, in which it could examine its spirit more successfully. Like, for example, 2,000 years ago, it would be the ancient Greeks, for example. The Egyptians before that. Every nation really has its own place in history, and he was very much kind of nationalistic in this sense at this time, because he believed that it was the German, or the Prussian, I guess it would be at this time. There's the Prussian time to shine. It was this Prussian era of enlightenment, and that is who you should listen to right now, because we are achieving our state of self-consciousness, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's a justification for obedience to the overbearing and powerful state.
Yes.
You're just a cog in the wheel. Get in line.
Yeah. It's very
young
grim.
Nazi.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that's really what he is. He's a Marxist. A very similar philosophy.
Yeah, it's very kind of easy to see, especially, in the Prussian region right now, kind of how that would lead to...
In that area? That era, you mean?
That era,
yes. Not now, then.
Yeah, then.
Yeah, where we're talking
that time
about
in that place
then
would
now.
lead to later ideas at that time.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't like his philosophy at all.
I don't. It's very, very grim, very bleak. You only exist to serve the state. And you will only ever succeed if your state succeeds, is really kind of the underlying philosophy there.
Right.
That's just not good.
Truly Marxist philosophy right there.
Yeah.
This is the state has all power and all, this basically worship of the government over everything else.
Yeah.
Very scary stuff. Very dangerous. Powerful stuff for some people.
Very much the exact opposite of the Rousseau philosophy.
But they both end up in the same place.
Yes. That's what I was going to say.
One with Napoleon, the other one with Hitler.
Very much,
Or a communist. I mean, that really is where we're going to.
It's eventually you either glorify the state so much as that they have complete control over you, or you destroy the state so much that you give very select people the exact same control over you that you didn't want to have in the first place.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, then you have, Robespierre, off with their heads and all that stuff until finally they killed Robespierre.
Yes. I was once compared to Robespierre, and I don't know how to feel about that.
By whom?
By a history teacher. I don't know why.
Which history teacher? And that's an insult.
I don't think he meant it as an insult.
That I would consider a cause to fight. If you compared me to Robespierre.
It was like 2 years ago at this point.
Yeah. No, it should not be forgiven.
All right.
Well, Robespierre was talented. He was a lawyer by training. And he had, at the beginning, he had a sense of justice. Now, this is his problem, though. He had an unwavering belief in his own righteousness, which may be what he was criticizing you for. I don't know. I don't know the context
I don't think
of this
so.
discussion.
I do not think so.
But Robespierre just murdered a lot of people.
Yeah.
He stabbed a lot of the fellow revolutionaries in the back, so to speak, by cutting off their heads.
It's not really stabbed in the back.
He was in charge of a murderous regime that killed thousands of people.
Yeah.
I mean, they executed nuns.
Mm-hmm.
They lined them up and brought them to the gallows and chopped their heads off. I mean, that's what we're talking about. And I mean, some of the bishops and priests, like, almost kind of sympathize, depending on how corrupt they were. Yeah. But I mean, the nuns of all people, because they just became it's like a bloodlust against the church, and they refused to repudiate their faith, so they killed him, and he is in it.
Yeah, horrible
person, horrible person.
I do not think that was the connection he was trying to draw. I think it was, yeah.
I don't know. I'd like to know what was he trying to say.
I don't know. I don't think.
Did you just say Robespierre, or did he have some sort of context?
I think there's some sort of context saying that it was a very effective speaker and very good at getting people to listen. I think was the connection there, which I guess is true about Robespierre.
Well, it was. Yeah, he could speak to the mob. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a very dangerous man.
Yes. I don't think I'm dangerous, but
well, maybe I should. Maybe your teacher. Maybe he meant it as a compliment, not knowing that the teacher was showing himself to be evil.
I don't think he's evil.
Robespierre is a pretty bad dude.
Yeah.
Historically.
Yeah.
But if you read some of his stuff that he said and he wrote, it sounds great on paper until he put it in practice. Because then then if you fought him or his ideals, eventually you get killed.
I guess it's kind of the 10%, like you were saying,
Oh, he had a lot more than 10.
Well, I know, but I mean, basically, it's very much a continuation of that. If we eliminate just these few people, then society will be better.
Right.
And then things don't get better. So we have to just eliminate these few more people.
Correct.
And then
that's
we'll
exactly
get there.
what it was.
Yep.
First you get rid of the emperor or the king. Then you have to get rid of the nobleman. Then you had to get rid of the church. Then you had to get rid of the people that were part of the noble class, even if they had supported the revolution to begin with and all the reforms to begin with. It's a never-ending.
Well, eventually Robespierre was killed, wasn't he?
Yeah, the Thermidor, because he killed too many people, and so they turned on him and they killed him, and he went to the guillotine too. But yeah, they had their own like pseudo-religious group that they formed that they like worshipped. They had their own. They worship reason. They called it the god of reason. They got so radical that they changed the days of the week in the calendar.
I didn't even know that.
Oh yeah, it's because it was the Gregorian calendar, and that's what they were associated with the church. So they renamed the days of the week and the months, and that's why the Thermidor counter-revolution is called Thermidor, because it happened on Thermidor, which is a name they gave for, I think it was a month or a week or whatever it was. I think each month was 4 weeks, and so it was on Thermidor that they had the counter-revolution, and they seized him and ultimately killed him.
Interesting.
It's a really crazy story. And it's almost unbelievable, but they believed in the ultimate value was egalitarianism. So is equality. It wasn't like in the United States, because these revolutions were happening all at the same time. The United States was individual rights and individual property rights too, which is the fundamental concept of American freedom. In
comes
France,
from John Locke.
Yeah, and in France,
last episode.
Correct. And in France, they had equality of all people. Well, the only way you get equality is like how you get the equality of your yard. You hit it with a mower, right? If you have equality of opportunity, you're going to have different levels of grass and weeds and all this sorts of stuff in your grass. But the philosophy of Robespierre and Rousseau, equality across the board.
And it definitely wasn't raising up the lowest pieces of grass. It was very much cutting everything off from the top.
And they gave the poor. It's very similar to the Greek democracy, where there's bread and circuses, or the Romans, I guess it would be bread and circuses, where they allowed. It's kind of interesting. Man, I'm going off on a complete tangent here.
It's the end of the episode. People have stopped listening already. If they're not listening to the tangents.
I mean, it's similar to. I was listening to Victor Davis Hanson the other day. Great, I think one of the most important political philosophers in America right now, certainly the last 20 years. But he is a historian, and he mentioned, once you get the Greeks realized that once you get everybody the equality to vote with no qualifications, eventually the fact that you can vote for change changes people to think that they should be able to be equal with everything else. So if you're equal to vote and to make these decisions, at some point you start looking around thinking, well, why aren't I equal in all other respects? In monetary possessions, intelligence, beauty, and they want to try to equalize all that stuff across categories. And that's when it gets really dangerous, because if half the people, if it's true democracy, that's why we don't have a true democracy, because we don't really have a democracy. We have a republic. And we have that tripartite system, the judicial and the legislative and the executive. So anyway, but I digress. But I would be horribly insulted if somebody said I was like Rousseau, even if they meant it as a compliment. What did you? Oh, Robespierre. It's even worse.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's a good place.
We're gonna have to talk off this podcast who this teacher was. So they need to pay this teacher a visit 2 years after the fact.
I did not think this would cause a problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's similar to saying, you remind me of Stalin. I mean, Stalin was an industrial scale murderer, and he was a murderer before he even came to power. He was just a thug, but very smart and effective killer. Anyway, I digress. We'll talk about this later.
All right.
Off camera.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. Well, this has been episode 22 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I am still Mark Bishop.
You're so offended by that. That was
if you know who he is, or who Robespierre is. I mean, he killed a lot of people with he had friends murdered.
Yeah. I don't think he was calling me a murderer, though.
Well, how do you separate that?
I don't know.
I mean, it's like, you can't.
Yeah. It's
not like, well, George Washington owned some slaves.
Yeah.
I mean, it's what Robespierre was known for. My opinion. My goodness.
Well, that'll be a little bleak after closing a segment there. Usually they're a little more lighthearted.